got that. Awesome.
I may leave it open.
You can close it after. I'm just going to be passing this through
Good
you.
afternoon, everyone. If I could have your attention, please. The conference will be starting in a short while. Please make your way to your seats for the welcoming remarks. Thank you. Okay, again, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon once more. We are about to start very shortly. We want to kindly ask for those who are to make their way into the auditorium to be seated. We'll be starting very shortly. Thank you very much.
Please take the time now to identify these exits. Once through these exits, proceed left or right towards the staircase. Enjoyed this afternoon's presentation.
A new day. With the first rays of light, the hope of a brighter future is awakening throughout the region. Every morning brings a new opportunity to make our dreams come true, to carve out our own destiny, and walk this path together. The time has come to start new projects, to value what makes us unique, to care for and restore our heritage, to work for a more efficient, inclusive, and resilient society, and prepare for the challenges to come. Never before have we had to face challenges as complex as today's. However, we now have the tools to overcome them. Every fall is the opportunity to learn that there is no adversity that can stop us if we face it together. It is time to sow a future in harmony with the world that nurtures us, to produce and protect its fertile fields and generous waters, to use our creativity to find solutions to the problems that still afflict millions of Latin American and Caribbean people, to walk the paths that unite us as brothers and sisters, to dream of a more prosperous, integrated, and united region. At CAF, we have been working for the well-being of our people for more than half a century through the financing of programs and projects that improve their quality of life, especially for the most vulnerable. We don't yet know the challenges that will come tomorrow, but today, we are certain that together we can overcome them. CAF, Development Bank of Latin America and the Caribbean.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ken Simmons, your Master of Ceremonies for this afternoon's proceedings. And on behalf of CAF, Development Bank of Latin America, and the Ministry of Finance of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the presentation of the 2021 Economy Development Report, Paths for Integration, Trade, Facilitation, Infrastructure, and Global Value Chains. This report explores the use of the regional sphere as a necessary complement to a strategy of global export expansion for Latin America and the Caribbean economies. To achieve greater regional and global integration, this report proposes initiatives in 3 specific areas: trade facilitation, physical infrastructure, and productive integration. Leaders and leading speakers will join us today to discuss integration and trade as effective instruments to achieve the goal of greater shared prosperity in Latin America and the Caribbean. We invite all attendees to share your opinions on social media with the hashtag RedCAF and to follow our accounts at AgendaCAF on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We also greet everyone who is following the event via streaming through our website, caf.com/en. Now, it's time to begin with opening remarks. It's my pleasure now to invite Mr. Sergio Diaz Granados, Executive President of CAF Development Bank of Latin America, to the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for him as he comes.
Good afternoon, Honorable Col Imbert, Minister of Finance of Trinidad and Tobago, a member of the Board of CAF, Mr. Christian Asinelli, Vice President for Strategic Programming in CAF, Alvin Hiller, Governor of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, Honorable Cabinet Ministers, Honorable Fairley Agustin, Chief Secretary of the Tobago House of Assembly, Your Worship Joel Martinez, Mayor of Port Spain, Your Excellency Rodolfo Sabons, Secretary General of the Association of Caribbean States, Mrs. Stacy Richards, Dr. Stacy Richards, Regional Manager for the Caribbean of CAF, Giampiero Leoncini, Representative of CAF in Trinidad and Tobago, Your Excellencies, members of the Diplomatic and Consular Corps, friends from our partners and international organizations, CAF colleagues, distinguished guests. I'm delighted to welcome you today to this international seminar to present and discuss CAF Flagship Reports 2021, Pathways of Integration. A very special thanks to the Minister of Finance for co-hosting this event and to the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago for receiving us today in the House as both our shareholders and valuable partners. On this special occasion, I'm honored to be the first president of CAF to visit Trinidad and Tobago since the country joined the organization in 2012 as a full member. Although our first activity in the Caribbean date back in the 90s, only 3 CARICOM nations are currently shareholders. Trinidad and Tobago, which became a shareholder in 1994 and full member of the bank in 2012, Jamaica, which became a shareholder in 1999, and Barbados, which did so in 2014. I would like to underline that today the bank here in Trinidad and Tobago is the main multilateral in terms of approvals and portfolio, which stands almost $1.2 billion, representing 4.1% of our total portfolio in CAF. We have supported the government efforts toward fiscal consolidation, and also we have made important investment in transport infrastructure, digital transformation, and help to cope with the impact of the pandemic also. Today we signed another operations with Minister Imbert and with the President of Prime Minister Rowley, new programs for the competitiveness of Trinidad and Tobago. Since I began as Executive President of CAF, I was convinced that one of the bank's main objectives should be expanding its membership in the Caribbean. Yesterday we were in Guyana talking with the President Ali and his cabinet members. And the reason is basically it's a natural thing to do for CAF. We have to integrate the region better and the Caribbean with Latin America especially. The Caribbean and the continental Latin America shares values, culture, challenge, history, geography. And today in a conversation with Prime Minister Rowley, even geological bonds. The Andeans are here. It starts here at Trinidad and Tobago. And CAF is being successfully consolidating itself as the forum and platform to make that integration possible. That's an important message I want to give you today. Consider CAF as an ally and a partner for development and as a bridge to connect with Latin America and the world. We have the experience and resources to go with the Caribbean in that direction. CAF has proven to be the local partner in the region, the one with the greatest fluidity and capacity to adapt to the particularities of shareholder countries quickly, efficiently, and effectively. Since its creation, as you see in the video, and now, inspired by the Declaration of Bogotá in 1968, CAF objective has been to contribute to sustainable development and regional integration. Over 50 years, we have relied on a true understanding of the reality of the countries within the region and interpreting the political and institutional opportunities transforming actions. This cooperative-based organization was born with the purpose of integration in the Andean sub-region and now through Latin America and the Caribbean. We have technically and financially supported programs and projects in crucial sectors, such as infrastructure, with a territorial approach, strengthening SMEs, improving logistics, health, education, border development, among others. Today, this is a bank that benefits 21 countries, 4 from the Caribbean, including Dominican Republic. Henceforth, integration is part of the CAF DNA, it's in our charter, it's a mandate for the bank, and in fact, CAF's first financing activity was this project, an integration project, a bridge across the Rio Limón between Venezuela and Colombia. We start with that, financing exports across the Andean region, financing infrastructure in the border. Yesterday in Guyana, we were talking the amazing opportunities that we have in the region if we connect, for example, Roraima with Guyana. The same message we talked today with Minister Imbert. We should enhance our integration, physical integration in the region. We firmly believe, we are inspired by that phrase of Colombian President Carlos Lleras Restrepo, pronounced in the creation of the Andean Pact and CAF. Integration is the way, integration is our destiny, integration is our spirit. The bank is a good example of the potential that our region has to create a virtuous entity based on consensus, solidarity, and integration spirit. The evaluation of authorized capital is a good way to walk the talk. And let me show that in an example of consensus. Chile was a founding member, dear Ambassador, was a founding member of CAF. In time, they removed from CAF, or they become again a member in 1992, and this year, the Congress approved the full membership of Chile again in CAF. So our South American dimension is growing thanks to that decision. So this is a great opportunity for the bank to integrate not only South America, but the Caribbean also, to integrate more the region. The bank is a good example of that. And the size of the bank equity has grown across the time, relying on the confidence of the countries in the institution. Our region has a powerful asset now, a solid financial leverage to support both the public and the private sector. A bank that has managed to achieve a credit rating that's superior to these members, AA+ in S&P. Annual approval of more than $13 billion, 20% mark for green financing, loan portfolio of $30.6 billion as September 2022. We have a LAC asset for LAC benefit. That has become the main development bank of the region, saved by Oxford University in 2021. It's part of the exercise of analysis of the regional banks. Chapter 7 of that book said this is a giant Gentile, and we must use that bank for the purpose of development in our region, the purpose of integration in our region. This bank starts as a seed for sub-regional industrial financier to Latin America main development bank. That's the reason of the bank. Even though the benefits of trade integration in the region are unquestionable in terms of poverty reduction, macroeconomic stability, and with the consolidation of larger, specialized and scale markets, the process has not brought all the benefits. Therefore, we must boost our efforts regarding LAC integration. With this statement in mind, last December in Cartagena, in Colombia, and after that in Asunción, in Paraguay, We present a value proposition to our board of directors and governors to strengthen the bank's equity. The result was the approval of the largest equity increase in the bank history, $7 billion. The value proposition that combined the capitalization, which was unanimously approved by the Board of the Assembly, include an explicit mandate for fresh resources to be prioritized for non-sovereign risk operations, work with subnationals, entities, and regional integration initiatives. One of CAF's value-added strengths is a contribution in knowledge. There are countless reports, studies, and public policy recommendations that are produced year after year for the benefit of the region. The most iconic is the Economic and Development Report, the RED. That is our flagship report that we're going to be discussing in the afternoon. It was first published in 2004, and since then has been released annually, addressing different topics according to the regional and global situation as a contribution to the debates, reflections, and discussions. Today, we are convened for the 2021st report entitled Pathways to Integration, Trade Facilitation, Infrastructure, and Global Value Change, will be presented by our CAF team. It addresses and questions the reasons for the modest results after all the countries undertook unilateral liberalizations and trade agreements, and why these actions not generate significant and sustained increase in interregional trade and has remained static at around 50% of total exports since the mid of the 90s. With that question in mind, we prepared this report. As will be presented by the team today, and we will see those areas that I mentioned before: trade facilitation, physical and functional and digital infrastructure, productive integration, and convergence around an ESG agenda. My experience as a Vice Minister and Minister for Trade in the past, I must recognize three multidimensional perspectives. The first is that we recognize that our territory is not homogeneous. We have a geographical challenge, capitals that are separated more than 3,000 miles away. For the reason we have to be creative and develop a truly functional and environmental sustainable physical infrastructure. Air, for example, logistics in air transportation will be key to connect the region. Secondly, is trade integration has been more regulatory than economic and productive. Efforts have been made to consolidate integration in the greater Caribbean with organizations such as the ACS and CARICOM. However, despite the reduction of tariff, non-tariff barriers and the limited development of regional value change continue to persist. And that is one of the tasks we want to tackle with the report. Third, it's important to point out that there are differences in the country's approaches and priorities, which means that there is not necessarily an alignment of expectations in the approach to integration processes. Although integration of LAC is a continental aspiration, it is at smaller scales that the greatest impacts can be generated. For this reason, CAF proposed in the RED to prioritize physical integration and carry out work on multi-connected regions. We believe that this approach can be the main driver of physical, functional, and digital integration between territories, intermediate subregions, and major consumption centers within the region. It's the case that we talked yesterday about Roraima, Guyana, and the whole Caribbean basin. To support this process, we designed and reorganized a course of action. In consequence, we now have instruments to help the identification, structuring, and financing projects, as well as to mobilize strategic partners. Going deeper, we made an effort in the report to propose a focused approach at the scale of logistic integration corridors and integral development areas. So starting from integrated markets and looking for the opportunities, long-term fruits in that opportunities. You can find concrete initiatives in the region, which we consider must be prioritized to reach a more effective way towards integration. As I shared before, CAF has a track record supporting countries in this direction. Hence, we have the experience and knowledge to work with the Caribbean under this approach. Between 1995 and 2021, CAF supported more than 92 projects in 10 areas of regional integration, with financing of $12.8 $75 billion. But one of the great challenges of integration is to move from vision to action and move from planning to implementation in shorter time frames. A greater effort is essential to its success, both in terms of greater investment and in terms of organization, management, facilitation, convergence of all stakeholders, public, private, academic, organized citizenships. CAF makes available the support instrument designed under 5 key intervention criteria: agility, execution, impact, sustainability, and coordination. We must identify and put into practice concrete projects and programs in multiple dimensions: commercial, productive, territorial, infrastructural, digital, cultural, tourism, regulatory, etc., and share them with citizens in order for them to recognize the value, benefits, and positive impacts of greater regional integration. Concrete recommendations here is be practical, optimize scale, anchor expectation, and seek to reduce commercial costs and inefficiencies. It is necessary to promote integration with a clear political aim, but at the same time with a pragmatic work agenda that allows overcoming the vision of competition, centrality, independence, toward a new vision of cooperation. In this regard, CAF has been making an effort to be present and active in international forums and meetings such as the CAN and CELAC, Summit of the Americas, CARICOM, Pacific Alliance, next week in Mexico, Mercosur, among others. The objective is to connect the region globally. For example, next year, in July and September, CAF will be promoting the dialogue between Latin America and the Caribbean region and the EU in the margins of the Heads of State meeting in Brussels, organizing a business summit as a convenient partner of Spain during the pro tempore secretariat of the UE and ECOFIN. Last week in Spain, I had the opportunity to talk with Vice President Calviño to prepare the first gathering of Ministers of Finance from the European Union and the Latin American countries. Together, we represent 1/3 of the IMF, 1/3 of the World Bank. From this time to next year, we have to prepare the technical notes and ideas of how to develop new tools for developing financing for the region. We have the opportunity to prepare that in 1 year and to gather all the Ministers of Finance to create a new sense of urgency for the financial sector in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's a concrete way to integration, trade and cooperation of both regions that are compatible. This is relevant also because the European Union countries are the main source of foreign direct investment in Latin America and the Caribbean, with a cumulative stock of $800 billion. Last week in Buenos Aires, it was a part of the conversation with the Minister of Foreign Affairs. That's the region that's more compatible with LAC, and we have a stock of investment that can create more value and more opportunities for the people in Latin America and the Caribbean. The total investment of the European Union in LAC is more than in China, Japan, Russia, and India combined. That value can create more opportunities in the future. With the above in mind, I would like to conclude with some key messages. CAF is a powerful asset that is owned by the Caribbean and the Latin Americans. We are ready to move forward with you all to make the most of it. We are aware that we cannot do it alone. This is why, since my arrival at CAF, I have visited almost all the countries in the region. I've met with more than 10 heads of state, official authority, and businessmen, seeking alliance, building bridges. We hope you will join in this effort. The greater Caribbean and the LAC region must unite and integrate to become stronger. If we do not work in a coordinated manner, respecting difference, joining efforts, and adapting to the new global dynamics, we will not have the capacity to recover our economies, generate true social cohesion, and strengthen our democracies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Diaz-Granados. We now, at this time, welcome the Honorable Colum Imbe, Minister of Finance of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Let's put our hands together and welcome him as he comes.
Thank you very much. The persons who assisted me with my speech gave me a quote from J.K. Rowling. I was a little too contemporary for me, but I'll give you the praise. We are only as strong as we are united, as weak as we are divided. I prefer a saying from Martin Luther King Jr. We must learn to live together as brothers or perish together as fools. It's my pleasure to extend these remarks on this very auspicious occasion, the launch of the CAF Regional Office for the Caribbean here in our capital, Port of Spain. Firstly, let me extend a welcome to Mr. Sergio Diaz-Granados, the Executive President of CAF, on his first visit to Trinidad and Tobago. I hope it will be one of many. On behalf of the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, let me also allow me to express our gratitude for the relationship that we have built with CAF, and we look forward to your continued support for our national development agenda. I truly believe your visit here will be meaningful and useful to all of us. To my colleague in CARICOM, the Honorable Ryan Strawn, Minister in the Ministry of Finance, Barbados, who I understand may join us virtually, His Excellency Rodolfo Sabonja, Secretary General of the Association of Caribbean States, Dr. Alvin Hilaire, Governor of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Jan-Yves Remy, Director, Sridath Rampal Center for International Trade, Law, Policy and Services, Mr. Christian Asanelli, who I am, well, a little afraid, but my friend, Christian Asanelli, Ms. Stacy Richards-Kennedy, our designated regional manager, and the entire CAF team, and all of the representatives of various countries, the diplomats who are here with us, and all other distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Very good afternoon. In a world where we continue to expand into a connected global economic space, impacted by each other's actions and becoming more vulnerable to external shocks, the theme Pathways for Integration, Trade Facilitation, Infrastructure, and Global Value Chains of this year's Flagship Economy and Development Report, RED 2021, is very appropriate. Trade plays several key roles in a country's economic activity. It diversifies and broadens access to global goods and services, accelerates dissemination of knowledge, and allows countries to build resilience and capacity to deal with external shocks, and also to speed up their recovery following such shocks. Caribbean countries are characteristically small, and thus more vulnerable to external shocks, and in several cases have undiversified economic structures. As such, it is virtually impossible for us in the Caribbean to produce and provide all of the goods and services we need, as well as acquire all the financial resources necessary to sustain our economies solely through the local sale of goods and services. Therefore, trade is and will continue to be a vital tool to the survival of our economies. It is this premise which guides the building of trade relations in the Caribbean Community and Common Market, or CARICOM, and through the awareness of the need to diversify the income portfolio of Caribbean economies, CARICOM has negotiated several reciprocal trade agreements in which Caribbean countries have access to markets and goods from other countries at preferential rates, and through the removal of several trade barriers. CARICOM currently has free trade agreements with the Dominican Republic and Costa Rica, and a trade, economic, and technical cooperation agreement with Colombia. Through these agreements, CARICOM countries such as Trinidad and Tobago can benefit from tariff reductions and the elimination of non-tariff barriers, including duty-free access on specific products, or phased reduction of duties on selected goods, and elimination at the border of all taxes on goods imported or exported. Additionally, trade with other economies expands our access to knowledge. The scale at which this knowledge is transferred, though, is arguable. At a micro level, when consumers import products from producers and innovators across the globe, there is a direct transfer of foreign product knowledge. Several Caribbean countries, however, are small island developing states whose citizenry cannot afford to purchase imported goods on a large scale. As such, there remains an inequality in the access to and transfer of knowledge about foreign products. Even Trinidad and Tobago, though considered a high-income developing country by the World Bank Group, has only been able to benefit from knowledge and technology transfer at a moderate pace within the current trade environment. Similarly, trade facilitation can assist in our preparation for shocks and can speed up our economic recovery following shocks. Through trade, developing countries are able to access expert intelligence from professionals across various fields to assist in awareness of our vulnerabilities, development of methods to protect against these vulnerabilities, and recover from negative impacts exacerbated by same, while facilitating access to international markets. The COVID-19 pandemic is a perfect example of the need for greater trade facilitation. Throughout 2020 and 2021, as COVID-19 attacked the world, Trinidad and Tobago experienced low trade performance. In 2020, the year in which COVID-19 was declared a pandemic, the value of Trinidad and Tobago's exports significantly declined, moving from TT 48.6 billion, or US 7.1 billion, in 2019 to TT 37.3 billion, or US 5.5 billion in 2020, a reduction of 23%. I dare say this was typical across most of the region. This trend, however, was completely reversed, again, not typical of the most of the region, in 2022, with exports projected to exceed TT 64 billion, or US 9.4 billion, over 50% increase since the advent of COVID-19, as a result of the demand created by the conjoined effect of the global economic recovery and the Ukraine war. However, as a result of lockdowns and public health restrictions during 2020 and 2021 arising from COVID-19, our earning potential was severely weakened. We were unable to engage in significant and meaningful economic activity during that period, largely due to the global disruption in supply chains, along with a collapse in global oil and gas prices, as we are energy economy. This not only highlights our interconnectivity and how shocks impact us, but further alerts to the susceptibilities of Caribbean countries and our dependence on foreign countries. 2020 and 2021, like many other countries, relied on countries in Europe and Asia, along with the US, which had readily available expert intelligence to produce vaccines and conduct research on a large scale to protect us against the virus. Greater trade facilitation would have allowed us to engage in more equitable trade in medical and disaster-related services to equip our population and assist our medical professionals with the necessary skills and knowledge to better prepare and respond to a shock like COVID-19. Just as an aside, it is noteworthy that although we had not had the experience of such a virulent global pandemic before, we in Trinidad and Tobago were able to rise to the challenge to respond to COVID-19 effectively, both from a health perspective and from an economic perspective. Though our trade performance has improved, moving from a visible trade balance of TT 12.5 billion, or US 1.84 billion in 2017, to TT 19.3 billion, or US 2.84 billion in 2021. Further, with the escalation in commodity prices in 2022, The latest data shows a projected increase in our balance of trade to TT 36 billion or US 5.3 billion, an increase of 86%, but that is just a sort of a superficial picture. When one looks deeper, the results from trade agreements have been modest, as highlighted in the red 21. Over the period 2017 to 2021, for example, Trinidad and Tobago's trade balance with the Dominican Republic decreased by 44%, moving from US 71.8 million in 2017 to US 40 million in 2021. Similarly, the country's trade balance with Costa Rica over the same period maintained a negative trade balance, with exports increasing marginally by 1.8% from US 10.1 million in 2017 to US 10.2 million in 2021. And as previously mentioned, these are countries with which CARICOM has free trade agreements. I asked my staff to find out why. And it turns out that the bulk of our trade with the Dominican Republic and Costa Rica was in the area of petroleum products. So it's little wonder. It is not a diversified trade. So when one looks at these facts, that as the prices of petroleum products became very volatile, our trade arrangements with the Dominican Republic and Costa Rica did not improve, in fact, did not do well at all. It is in this light that increasing trade facilitation is critical to the region. According to the WTO, trade facilitation refers to the simplification, modernization, and harmonization of export and import processes. This is a very important undertaking, as it allows both governments and business to benefit in the sale and purchase of goods and services across markets. The advantages of trade facilitation experienced by the business community are vast and flow down to the general population in several, if not all cases. Through trade facilitation, the business community profits from lower trade-related costs and reduced delays in the delivery of their raw materials, which allows them to better serve their consumers by providing goods on time and at a more economical cost. There's also enhanced competitiveness, which forces businesses to maintain and provide goods of the highest quality. This benefits citizens as high-quality goods are made available to consumers at close to international market prices. Moreover, simplified and modernized trade processes give room to governments to enhance controls, not in terms of imposing trade restrictions, but rather through greater awareness on the items transmitted to and through their countries. This strengthens national security systems, especially important in small island states, especially in the Caribbean, which have experienced rising crime rates due to cracks in outdated customs processes and systems. Countries whose trade processes allow for swift and feasible import and export of production inputs and finished goods are more attractive locations for foreign firms seeking to invest, thereby increasing foreign exchange inflows, which is an impetus to export growth in a country. This also further improves economic development in countries, as local consumers can be offered an array of high-quality, reasonably priced goods and services. And allow me to digress. I went to a CAF meeting in Uruguay some time ago, and at the hotel we were staying in, close to it, there was a, let's call it a market or a mall, in which there was a vast array of consumer items for sale. And myself and the team that went with me, we went one day to look at this market. And what we noticed is that virtually everything for sale there was from countries in South America. Virtually everything. And I asked about it, and they said that is what the countries in that region do. They trade with each other. I didn't see very much from the United States there at all. And I do wish we in the Caribbean can reach that level of trade, integration, and facilitation that I saw in Uruguay. So taking this into account, Trinidad and Tobago has developed several initiatives to improve its trade environment. Most recently, the country launched its Trinidad and Tobago Trade and Business Information Portal, TBIP, and our Fit for Europe 2 initiatives. The TBIP, a fundamental component of our TT BizLink, which is the first single electronic window in the Caribbean, needs upgrading now, provides access to multiple tools and resources under the categories of trade, business, and investment. This portal supplies parties interested with detailed step-by-step guidance on how to import and export goods and information on regulatory requirements for starting or expanding a business, as well as what is necessary to undertake an investment. Through our Ministry of Trade and Industry, along with our National Export Promotion Agency, Export TT, the country unveiled its Fit for Europe 2 initiative through the assistance of the CARIFORUM European Union Economic Partnership and the CARICOM Single Market and Economy Standby Facility for Capacity Building. This is managed by the Caribbean Development Bank with EU funding. This program seeks to establish an online focal point for trade queries, build the capacity of local entrepreneurs, generate new trade opportunities, and build networks within select markets in Europe. Now, it must be remembered that Caribbean countries will remain small island developing states, vulnerable to external shocks and changes in local markets, and now climate change. And our local businesses and people must be protected. So Caribbean governments must therefore remain committed to safeguarding the most vulnerable in our societies. It's easy to let down our guard to benefit from the promises of trade facilitation, but we must practice due diligence in sheltering our own people. As such, governments should focus on developing integrated policy approaches to both pursue the economic gains and opportunities for growth that come from greater trade facilitation, such as the removal of barriers, reduction in costs that can prevent people and firms from participating in trade, protect workers as opposed to solely protecting gains in a specific industry or market. Therefore, more investment is needed in training and support programs, for example, through the provision of information to job seekers, potential exporters, as well as the establishment of safety nets to support workers, exporters, and their families undergoing change as they take advantage of opportunities in other sectors or industries that present a greater competitive advantage for them. For Caribbean countries, especially those which are susceptible to huge trade volatility, it may mean extending beyond traditional adjustment assistance offered to more strategic investment approaches, inclusive of well-designed income support and counter-cyclical social spending. As such, CAF has assisted the government of Trinidad and Tobago greatly in its journey towards greater strategic investments. It has aided us in the expansion of our country's technical capabilities, in our aim to improve the standard of living of our citizens, while considering our exposure to certain risks and gradually removing obstacles that have stymied our efforts. As we previously told the Secretary General of CARICOM, CAF is a multilateral banking institution that has a different approach. And you heard the President talk about this. He has to say that, he's the President. But I am saying from a country perspective, CAF has a completely different approach to other banks. It's agile, it's flexible, and client-oriented. That's its approach to development finance. Flexible, swift, quick, client-oriented. Since completing our full membership process in 2016, Trinidad and Tobago has received financing from CAF for, as the President said, just over $1.2 billion to support our macroeconomic reforms, infrastructure development, digital transformation, as well as emergency support to face the pandemic, as previously mentioned. We have also received valuable technical assistance, US $2 million in non-reimbursable resources for strategic projects to help us with flooding, urban transport, and to digitalize our tax payment system, among others. I truly believe the bank is ready to expand its operations and is willing to offer support to all CARICOM nations who may need access to development financing from our new regional hub, which is to be located in Port of Spain, which is located in Port of Spain. I believe this will offer an opportunity to develop pathways for cooperation between CARICOM and CAF that must be seized. I'm truly happy that CAF has chosen Trinidad and Tobago and Port of Spain as the headquarters for the new regional hub. I, as Minister of Finance, a member of the government, will do whatever I can, together with my colleagues in government, to ensure that CAF realizes its vision of integrating the English-speaking Caribbean into the entity that is CAF. I believe the work of CAF is extremely valuable, and critical to the development of Caribbean countries. And I look forward to the findings and recommendations of this session today, Red 21. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister, for your remarks. Now we will begin the presentation of the 2021 Economy and Development Report, Paths for Integration, Trade, Facilitation, Infrastructure, and Global Value Chains. Please enjoy this video prepared as an introduction to the report.
Integration between Latin American and Caribbean countries has been an ardent desire for the region for many decades. And today, more than ever, it is critical for trade and economic recovery. How does the physical proximity of Latin American and Caribbean countries affect their performance and trade integration? How effective have the reductions in tariffs and non-tariff barriers been in promoting intra-regional trade? How does Latin American and Caribbean trade and integration compare to other regions and trading blocs? CAF, Development Bank of Latin America and the Caribbean, presents its 2021 Economy and Development Report, Pathways to Integration, Trade Facilitation, Infrastructure, and Global Value Chains. A document that analyzes the underlying causes of low regional integration and proposes concrete actions on and about trade facilitation, physical infrastructure, and productive integration. Visit www.cioteca.caf.com and download the 2021 Economy and Development Report. CAF, Development Bank of Latin America.
To present the report, we welcome Liam Alub, Principal Economist of CAF's Socioeconomic Research Department. So let's put our hands together as we welcome Mr. Alub to the floor.
So good afternoon. Thanks everybody for being here, and in particular to all the authorities and all the panelists, participants that are going to discuss the challenges for integration in the Caribbean countries with Latin America with Stacy. So it's a great pleasure to present the flagship report of CAF 2021, Pathway to Integration, Trade Facilitation, Infrastructure, and Global Value Chain. So the first thing that we ask in the report is, why is international trade important? And this is because of three main reasons. First, it allows to expand the markets, to sell products and to buy inputs. Second, it promotes gain from specialization and economies of scale. And third, it promotes and fosters the knowledge spillovers between domestic firms and foreign firms. And all these boost productivity and welfare. And the next question that we ask in the report is, well, what is the role that regional integration plays in achieving these goals? And regional integration is key for two reasons. First, it's very important for global value chains. Global value chains have a very important part of regional value chains. So regional integration is key to get involved in global value chains. The other is that once tariffs are lower and other non-tariff barriers are decreased, the proximity becomes a crucial advantage. So exploiting this advantage depends on trade facilitation, infrastructure, and other regulation that allows, that are components of trade costs. So with this in mind, most of Latin American and the Caribbean countries have implemented trade liberalization policies that decrease significantly the tariff applied. In the graph, we see the averages for the OECD, for Latin America, for the CARICOM countries in the black line, and for the 3 CAF members, Barbados, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago. We can see that most of the countries have decreased the applied tariffs, but the levels in Latin America and in the CARICOM especially are still above the OECD country level. So we are doing efforts to decrease applied tariff, but we are still a lot of room to improve yet. And what are the main reasons the main explanation of why the tariffs are higher in Latin America and the Caribbean compared to the OECD countries is not so much the intra-regional tariff or the tariff to our neighbors, but the tariff with other member states or the members outside our region are still very high. So this is the main explanation of why the tariff levels are higher. So apart from this tariff reduction, what we observe is that the trade in the region did not increase so much. It shows a moderate increase, and in particular for the CARICOM countries, it shows a decrease compared to 1980. So CARICOM countries are the most open if we measure trade over GDP, but the averages from the 1984 average to 2015, 2019 average, it decreased from over or close to 100% to less than 80%. So CARICOM countries are still the most open, or are still more open than the rest of Latin America, but the trend it's not what we expected when we started signing all these trade agreements. And when we measure the trade involvement of Latin America and the Caribbean in the trade community, we observe that the export participation of Latin America is maintained at 5% over all these 4 decades, and the CARICOM participation decreased from 0.6% to 0.1%. So there is still room for CARICOM countries to regain the participation in international trade that they had in the 1980s and to promote exports and imports in the region. So what can be behind this decrease in the participation of CARICOM countries and Latin America stagnation in trade? Well, the report proposed a low participation of intra-regional trade. When we observe the average for 1995 to 1999, the intra-regional trade in most Latin American regions were lower than the ones that we observe for more advanced regions. And the evolution of this intra-regional trade did not increase. So most of intra-regional trade were maintained or decreased over this period. And like more advanced regions, they started at higher levels and they were maintained or slightly decreased, or other regions like the Asian community shows an important increase in this period. So intra-regional trade could be an explanation, and when we observe global value chain participation, what we observe in this graph is that Latin America have a lower participation in global value chains, but more importantly, a very low participation in regional value chains. In this graph, the horizontal axis measures the participation of foreign value added in export, and the vertical axis measures how much of this foreign value added is from the region. What we observe is that in Europe, Asia, and North America, a big part of the foreign value added is coming from the region. This is not the case for Latin America. and it's not the case for mostly any region in Latin America, not the case for CARICOM neither. So CARICOM has a very low participation of regional value added in exported value added. So in the report, we also try to disentangle how much or how was the evolution of trade cost that the evolution of trade flows predict. And what we observe, so what we present here are measures of proximities. Measures of proximities are the inverse, or you can think it as the inverse of trade cost. And what we observe is that the most advanced regions like North America, Europe, and Asia, or the Southeast Asia countries, they increase their proximity, both intra-regional proximity and extra-regional proximity, with a bias toward intra-regional proximity. That means that the intra-regional cost decreased more than the extra-regional cost. When we observe the Latin American region, what we observe is that Central America and the Caribbean follow this path, but to a lesser degree. And the South American countries, they increase the extra-regional proximity, but they decrease the intra-regional proximity. So what can we do to foster regional integration? So we can work on the trade cost component, tariff, non-tariff barriers, border costs, infrastructure, and other regulations. And what the report proposes to work on these last three components, or where it focuses. So I will go very fast in this part with the measure of trade cost. What we do is to develop a gravity model of trade to disentangle what part of the evolution of intra-regional trade is explained by each component. And in most regions, the size component is the most important, but we can see that in most of the regions, also the trade policy played a very important role. In particular, in the Andean community and in Central America, almost 25% of the increase in intra-regional trade was explained by preferential or non-preferential trade policy, and this is also the case for the other developed regions. I apologize because we don't have data for the CARICOM in this graph, but I guess that for the CARICOM countries would be similar. And when we measure the negative effect of distance, what we find is, as expected, that the distance played a very important negative role in all the regions, but in Latin America and the Caribbean, and here we include the Caribbean countries, it plays a more significant role. So distance seems to be a more important cost in Latin America and the Caribbean than in other regions. And then the report focuses on the three areas of intervention. First, on trade facilitation and border costs. That is so as the Ministry of Finance stated, trade facilitation is the simplification, harmonization, digitalization, and standardization of all the procedures that are needed to perform a trade operation. When we observe how the CARICOM countries are doing, and Latin America in general, what we observe is that we still have room for improvement. Our trade costs, both in times and in money, are still higher than in other regions like the US and Canada or the European Union. And especially in times, we are still we show much higher time costs. Other way of analyzing the trade facilitation indicators is using the trade facilitation index measured by the OECD. And what we observe here is that Latin America and the Caribbean in general has room for improvement, but the performance of the countries are very heterogeneous, both among Latin American and the Caribbean countries and even within the Caribbean countries. So what we observe is that CARICOM has a big space for improvement compared to achieve the levels of the US and Canada and the European Union. Trinidad and Tobago is the country with the best or the highest levels, but still are below the average for Latin American and the Caribbean countries. So there are room for improvement, and when we study each dimension of this index, we observe that there are a lot of room for improvement in most of the dimensions, but especially in the cooperation with external and internal trade agencies. So what can we do to foster trade facilitation? We can work on single windows, we can work on authorized economic operator, and in both of these cases, the existence of a trade agreement could help to give a boost to the reduction in cost, because for example, in the single windows, we can have the interoperability of the single windows. That probably it's easier to have it with our trade partners. Regarding the role of transport infrastructure, transport is very important because it allows goods to go from the place of production to the port, from the port of origin to the port of destiny, and from the port of destiny to the place of consumption of production. And it becomes more salient when tariff and other non-tariff barriers are decreased, and also it allows to take advantage of geographic proximity. And there are, within the transport cost, it has some important characteristics. First is that it has a network structure, so when we improve one link or one node, then the cost of all the network is decreased. Then it has a modal composition, so we have trains, we have trucks, we have planes, and we have to take into account all these modal, all these transport modes in order to think on the transport network. And it also has links and nodes, and many times where we improve the links and we don't improve the nodes, and this creates bottlenecks in the nodes, and the gains that we were expected are not realized. When we study the cost of trade, or the transport cost in South America compared to other regions, what we observe is that for intra-regional trade in Central America and the Caribbean, it shows a similar pattern or a similar level to the Europe. In South America, it's much higher, so there is a lot of room to improve there for South America. And in terms of extra-regional trade, the performance it's almost the same as in Europe for both regions. So what can we do to improve infrastructure? When we take into account how much countries spend in terms of infrastructure, in terms of GDP, we observe that the levels are similar to those of the OECD, but the problem is that our countries are much poorer. So the amount that we have to spend is less. And so it becomes very important. Two things. One is how we prioritize the project, and in there is where we propose, as President Diaz-Granada mentioned, the focus on logistic corridors that provide support to the whole value chain from end to end, and it takes into account not only the links, but also secondary and tertiary networks and logistics areas, logistic development areas. And this focus on logistic corridors are an important role in most of the development plans of multilateral organizations and in many countries in the regions already. The other is to have an adequate balance between new projects, maintenance, and replacement of infrastructure. And in particular, maintenance, it takes 1/3 of the total spending in the lifetime of a project. And many times we don't pay enough attention to the maintenance and the service that this infrastructure provides. It's not good through all the lifetime of the project. So maintenance, it's important, and we have to pay the adequate attention to it. And finally, multilateral organizations can play a role in infrastructure projects that do not have the cost and benefits evenly distributed among countries, and cooperation is needed in order for this infrastructure to take place. Then the report studies what is the role of energy integration. Energy integration, it's important because it has benefit in decreasing the cost and increasing the productivity of energy production, but also it can allow countries to diversify their energy production matrix to make it more green, that it will be very important in the next couple of years. And it has some necessary conditions. One of the most important is that the transmission network supports this trade, and it has faced some obstacles in the recent years that mostly in South America, there were some institutional weaknesses that even though we have the infrastructure to have trade, it was subutilized. And the other is the concept of energy security, that if all countries produce enough energy, then trade will be residual. No? We have a very nice experience in Latin America, that is the Central American energy market, that fostered the trading in energy among Central American countries, and some of them became net exporters and the other net importers of energy, but most importantly, it allows to make the system more stable and to diversify their production matrix. In South America, even though the bar seems high in terms of the domestic consumption of all these countries, the trade means a very little share of total consumption. But in South America, we also have a nice experience that is Uruguay, that invests a lot in green energy, and Uruguay is exporting energy to Brazil and Argentina. So there are some challenges for energy integration that I will skip in sake of time. But most importantly is we need regulatory harmonization, and we have to have nice institutions and good institutions that regulate this trade, such that countries can be confident that if they need energy, they will have it from their partner. The last chapter is about global value chains and the participation in value chains. And what is this participation in value chains is that within the globalization processes, the production of a good have been splitted or fragmented and the goods are produced in different countries. And depending where these countries are located, we will call the value chains differently. So if the production processes take place in the domestic and regional countries, we will call this value chain a regional value chain. If it takes place in domestic countries and extra-regional countries, we will call it an extra-regional value chain. And if it takes place in domestic, regional, and extra-regional countries, are gonna be called a mixed value chain or a global value chain. So global value chains can be regional or extra-regional. And when we take a look at how the region perform in terms of global, regional and global value chains, we separate the analysis in forward and backward participation. Forward is the countries providing inputs to the rest of the world. Backward is countries using inputs from foreign countries. We can observe that the participation in intra-regional value chains is mostly, it's very little, mostly in all the countries, except for Trinidad and Tobago, Bolivia, and Paraguay, that are energy exporters to the region. And most of the countries are, or have a higher participation in extra-regional value chain, and mainly as in a backward way. So they are users of, or they participate in the final stages of the production processes. Except for in the CARICOM countries, again, Trinidad and Tobago, as the main exports are related to petroleum and as inputs in the production processes. So what can we do to foster participation in global value chains? One thing is to work on rule of origins. Rule of origins are the necessities or what we need for the good to maintain the tariff preferences that countries have. And we need these rule of origins to not discourage the trade of inputs among regional countries, and we should allow for the possibility of accumulation between agreements. We also should foster vertical FDI, and not only because it will bring investment, but also because this investment can foster knowledge spillover among domestic and foreign firms and make the domestic firms more productive, or to develop new goods to supply it or that buy the goods that these foreign firms produce. And we don't need a special sectorial policies for this, but we need a stable and reliable business environment and trade openness such that these foreign firms can operate in the countries and know that they can realize their gains. And finally, one important sector for the participation in global value chains is the service sector. And service sector plays two main roles. One is as an exporting sector. The service sector has increased their export dramatically in the last 20 or 30 years, but also services are very important to add value to the exporting goods, both in terms of diversification or introducing knowledge, so we can make our goods to have a higher price if we introduce services in the manufactured goods. So with this, I will finish. So the final remarks are that trade integration allows countries to expand their markets and promotes gains in specialization and economies of scale that can boost their productivity and welfare. Although, as the Ministry of Finance said, it may require a compensatory mechanism between sectors that benefit and do not benefit from trade. The signing of numerous free trade agreements in Latin America make that most of trade within Latin America is free of tariff, almost 85%. But there are still places to reduce tariff with extra-regional countries. However, intra-regional trade it's low, without much dynamism in the last 30 years. And part of this explanation could be because of the low participation of countries in regional and global value chains. And this report proposed a pragmatic agenda to promote greater regional integration, and this is to work on trade facilitation to decrease border costs, on physical infrastructure to reduce transport costs, and on regulations to foster productive integration. Thank you very much. I hope that you have enjoyed the talk.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alou, for such an insightful presentation today. Now, before we go any further, let me remind you that you can share your opinions with us on social media using the hashtag RedCAF. We also invite you to follow our social media handles at AgendaCAF on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So as we continue, let's move on to our panel discussion. It is now my pleasure to introduce to us today the moderator for this panel, Dr. Stacy Richards Kennedy, Regional Manager for the Caribbean of CAF. So can we welcome her as she enters the stage? My left, her right. She's going to be seated at the first chair. Thank you. Now, please join me in welcoming to the stage the speakers for this panel this afternoon. Dr. Alvin Hilaire, Governor of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. His Excellency Rodolfo Sabonge, Secretary General of the Association of Caribbean States. Dr. Jan-Yves Remy, Director of the Sridath Ramphal Center for International Trade Law Policy and Services at UE. And the Honorable Ryan Strawn, Minister in the Ministry of Finance of the Republic of Barbados, who is joining us virtually via Zoom. Am I correct? Yes? Yes. Excellent. And I will turn over to Dr. Richards Kennedy.
Thank you very much to our moderator, to our Master of Ceremonies, for that very kind introduction to our panel. Good afternoon to everyone. Buenas tardes. Warm greetings to all. With the protocol for this afternoon's program having already been established, I'd like now for us to go straight into a very robust, substantive discussion on the findings of the CAF flagship report entitled Pathways to Integration, focusing, of course, on trade facilitation, infrastructure, and global value chains. As you would have heard, CAF contributes to the development of Latin America and to the Caribbean through two main ways: the provision of development assistance and through knowledge dissemination and exchange. And of course, development funding is crucial in that it allows our member countries to develop their infrastructure as well as their economic, environmental, and social programs. However, education and knowledge are also equally critical to development and thus play a key role in CAF's operations by guiding the design and development effectiveness of our operations. This afternoon, our esteemed panelists will delve deeper into this very important issue of trade integration in Latin America and the Caribbean, and in particular, intra-regional trade integration, both within Latin America and the Caribbean, and also between Latin America and Caribbean. So the work that needs to happen and to be increased and strengthened between our two subregions, with an emphasis on infrastructure development and insertion in global value chains. To complement Leon's presentation of the report, we will now distill the findings of the report a bit further and take the discussion from 30,000 feet to 3,000 feet so that we can engage with our panelists on the role that greater regional and global integration of the Caribbean countries can play, in particular, as our countries seek to revitalize their economic recovery and social development following the pandemic. I'd like to start with our Honorable Minister Strawn, who joins us virtually from Barbados, one of our CAF member countries with which we have established a very strong partnership, particularly over the last 5 years. So Minister Strawn, welcome. And I'm going to start off by saying that in the last couple years, the concepts of reshoring and nearshoring started to gain importance in trade discussions, motivated by the US-China trade conflict, the pandemic, and the Russian invasion into Ukraine. We'd like to ask you to share with us what you think are opportunities that nearshoring can bring to the Caribbean countries, and in particular to Barbados. Is there any infrastructure or trade policy you consider of first order importance to be able to take advantage of this opportunity? Over to you, Minister.
Hello, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes. Yes, and no, I heard the question, and my apologies for not being able to join you in person. But these are the times that we're in. But let me say that it is important that this conversation is taking place, and I want to thank CAF for supporting this event, because as you know, whilst we have responsibility for the single market and economy, it is critical that as we seek to leverage our productive capacity, certainly within the region, to respond to the issues in terms of enhancing our food security, the concept of nearshoring and the possibilities that exist right now, not just for countries like Barbados, but I believe for the region, to be able to develop where appropriate, whether it's high value manufacturing or any of those high value services which Barbados tends to concentrate on, that there are indeed tremendous opportunities within that space to be able to help us to do that. What is absolutely required, and one of the things that we have been advocating for, certainly within the context of small island developing states, is to have the policy space to be able to create those spaces, if you like, the policies that would allow for small countries to be, who are also vulnerable, given all that is taking place in the global market, to be able to create enough space to maintain the livelihoods of our businesses in terms of businesses across the Caribbean, but certainly in the context of individuals being able to yield the same level of return, given that we do have a reasonably high level of savings across the region, but we simply do not have the same level of rates of return as others across the world. And therefore, the prospect of more activity coming near shore in the context of any of these trade agreements being carved out specifically to allow small island states like Barbados, Trinidad, or others to be able to help facilitate, I think would be particularly significant. From our perspective, certainly we do quite a bit of international support for business in general. And therefore, in addition to any potential expansion as it relates to whether it's manufacturing or any of agriculture processing, any of those areas, we feel it's important that a regional response will be appropriate such that we are not competing with each other in terms of for the same things. And therefore, from a regional perspective, I believe that we should, as far as possible, try to coordinate around where do we best leverage our particular advantages, but done in a way that is strategic enough to allow the region to be able to give itself enough of a buffer. Because as we've seen, certainly with respect to the onset of the pandemic, as well as now with the war in Ukraine, we are simply too small, even collectively, to distort any trade or command any attention with respect to chain. And therefore, we must, as we have done with respect to the carve-out that we are seeking in relation to UNCTAD and the WTO, is to press for as I said, the appropriate policy space to be able to build out our industries, because over time, it will be clear that we will not be able to necessarily compete in the way that production is done in other parts of the world. And therefore, this initiative certainly will help to, in our mind, accelerate the integration of CARICOM. It is important that we also seek to see how we can expand our productive capacity and focus more on exports, which is what Barbados is doing under our Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation Program 2022, particularly in the post-pandemic era, because it is critical that we are able to take advantage of not just what is being decided globally, but we must be able to carve out specifically a unique Caribbean solution for what confronts us, I think, as a region. And therefore, Barbados remains committed to continue to advocating on behalf, certainly, of the region to be able to have those carve-outs. But as we come back now into our own policy spaces across the region, that we continue to support the development of businesses across the region in a collaborative way, such that the different private sectors or even the different governments, that we're able to pool our resources in a way that makes sense for the average citizen to be able to mobilize those domestic resources that we do have. If we are not able to do that, then it wouldn't matter effectively over the long term whether or not the nearshoring or anything actually comes to the region, if we don't build an inclusive process with respect to having people being able to invest easily, certainly across borders, in opportunities that can yield them a decent rate of return. And in so doing, you're building resilience across the region, particularly in the post-COVID-19 environment that has been particularly difficult with respect to families, with respect to businesses, and certainly with governments having to respond to extraordinary circumstances, that unless the recovery is inclusive and that the policies are done such that they build or they have resilience, I should say, as a critical part of the policy stance, then we would not, in my view, be able to take advantage of these very critical areas. I'll end on this particular point, because I think as we seek to achieve issues, assure food security in the context of the region, then it is important that as we have been facing all of us have been facing these challenges with respect to fuel costs as well as food costs as it relates to the, across the region. I believe that from that perspective, our focus must be as a region must be on how do we enhance and achieve the 25 by 25 agenda quickly, whilst at the same time as a region, focusing on how do we create the renewable energy thrust right across the region to be able to help insulate ourselves with respect to what is going to happen moving forward, such that any initiative that we are able to take advantage of, that we're actually able to produce and keep the cost of business down right across the region, such that our level of competitiveness, so that whatever it is that we may be producing, given that we do have relatively high labor costs in the context of the region and certainly here in Barbados, that we're able to control those two very critical things, such that we are building resilience, we are reducing the cost of doing business and across the region, and able then to be able to make the region as competitive as possible. I believe that if we're able to focus on that over the next few years, that will help to drive the integration process, and at the same time set the Caribbean on a path of growth, which I think will then yield sustainable dividends for the long term. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Strawn, for those very insightful reflections. And you know, the point that you made emphasizing the importance of policy coordination across CARICOM SIDS is one that cannot be overemphasized, because it really is critical to leveraging our strengths as a region and enhancing our competitive advantage. You also touched on a very key point that is an excellent segue into our next question to Dr. Hilaire, which has to do with renewable energy. And so now I'll turn to you, Dr. Hilaire. As you know, Caribbean countries are steadily instituting measures to adapt to climate change. One of the sectors that will be more heavily affected by climate change policy is the energy sector, in particular with the efforts that are underway to replace fossil fuels like petroleum or gas with non-conventional or rather more environmentally friendly energy sources like solar and wind plants. This will no doubt affect oil and gas exporting countries like Trinidad and Tobago. So my question to you is, how should countries like Trinidad and Tobago prepare to deal with this transition to a new world with lower use of fossil fuels and to deal with this transition to a more environmentally friendly energy matrix?
Yes, thank you very much for that question, and welcome to those who are here in Trinidad and Tobago for the first time, or if you're visiting us once more. We are privileged to have CAF with us, and we look forward to entertaining you and to be part of you. Now, climate change is real. It is not a hoax. It is not something abstract. We are already seeing it. We are looking at rising sea levels. We are looking at problems and the higher levels of temperature. We are seeing the vicissitudes in the weather patterns. So it is something real. It is something that the world has to deal with. And we in Trinidad and Tobago are committed to be part of the solution. For countries like Trinidad and Tobago, however, we are also part of the problem, in a sense, because our resources are based in large measure on those items that contribute to global warming. So we have natural gas, we have other energy products, petroleum, etc., that contribute to global warming. So we have some work to do. How do we deal with that? In our case, we have a number of things that we need to focus on. And let me just start with four priority areas for us. And before that, just to emphasize how important energy is, it contributes a huge part of the government coffers. Minister Imbut would attest to that. It contributes an important part of our reserves, of our exports, and our GDP. So we are part of it. It is part of us. It helps us to weather the storms. We have experienced a global pandemic, as was said, the likes of it we've never seen before, and other big storms. But Trinidad and Tobago, like some other energy exporting countries, has been able to weather the storm because we've been able to build big buffers when times were good. So, for example, we have a substantial Heritage and Stabilization Fund, which is a sovereign wealth fund that puts away some of our resources for a rainy day, which was here with us. Then we have strong international reserves. So when a storm hits us like the pandemic, we were able to do some financing as opposed to immediate and harsh adjustment. So it gives us some breathing space. So you know that we are vulnerable in that sense, because if we switch away from this resource, then it could create problems. But we have to do it. So let me talk about four ways that I think is important for us and other countries to deal with this issue. The first is by study and national dialogue. This is a scientific issue. We have to know the facts. We have to discuss the facts. What is global warming? What is our contribution to it? How can we deal with it? And we have to have a national dialogue on the issue. I don't know about in other Caribbean countries or in Latin American countries, but climate change is not on the political agenda as in some other places. It might be other things, other more juicy subjects. But climate change, it's an abstract concept. It needs to be part of people's psyche. They must know that when levels of the oceans rise, it affects us all, particularly the small Caribbean countries. So I think that is important for nations to come together, for schools, for politicians, for the economists, to calibrate, but also to explain it to the public so they feel it. The second thing is that, well, we are where we are. We are blessed with natural resources and other countries, and you can't just dismiss it. As I said, it has created great buffers for us. It has allowed our country to have a great standard of living, high income, etc. So we have to deal with it. We have to use it. So in the short run, we have to make the most of our natural resource while looking firmly at the timeline. What do I mean? Well, in the energy industry, we may have some issues with production, with downstream industries. We have to clean those up. We have to look at the tax regime. We have to make the most of what we have. It's just like at the central bank. We are all moving towards a cashless society. But in the short run, we have to make sure that we have our proper, our cash machines are working, and our cash processes at the central bank are streamlined. So you don't give away your natural resources, but you know that you have to work with it in the short run. So that's the second thing. The third thing is, of course, that we have to be able to create incentives away from these resources. Now, this is easier said than done, because human nature is such that once you have something and it's working for you, well, you're not giving it up. And this is where the whole issue of are these resources a blessing or a curse comes in, and the matter of Dutch disease. In Trinidad and Tobago, like many other countries, because we are blessed with this resource, we have moved away from other things that can contribute to trade or welfare. So agriculture, tourism, other things, we more focus on energy and non-tradable activities. So trying to get away from this, what you call Dutch disease, is not easy, but I think it's important to create an atmosphere where resources will move to these activities in an efficient way So reducing the cost of doing business is important. Streamlining processes, making things very easy to do. And sometimes you may have to have very targeted subsidies to be able to allow resources to move. That is important. Otherwise, if you try to do it, just say you pick a winner and it won't happen, because people will gravitate towards what is making them wealthy, what is making them happy, what is easiest. So moving those resources. The last item is that countries like Trinidad and Tobago, as the rest of the world, must be part of the global effort to address climate change. And I know we have committed in Trinidad and Tobago and many other countries to the Paris Accord. Let me just tell you a few of the things that we are doing at the central bank itself. One of the things is to measure our carbon footprint and to look at areas of energy saving. I still run around taking off lights in my place. People get mad with me, but that's the way I am. And just to make sure that we ourselves don't contribute to the problem, so we look at it internally. We are part of a global network of financial institutions, commercial, mainly central banks, and international institutions called Network for Greening the Financial System. So this is a commitment that we have. We have to join some work streams and contribute to the efforts to have the financial sector reforms put on the international scene and as well as the regional scene. Another thing that we are doing is a concrete expression of our commitment is investing our international reserves in ESG or energy supporting activities. So in July, I think it was, we went to our board, and the board approved a component up to 2% of our international reserves can be invested in ESG activities. So in September, we invested $30 million in World Bank sustainability bonds, two sustainability bonds. And we think this is a concrete expression because, you have to put your money where your mouth is at some point, so this is what we're doing. And the final thing on that front is that we are working with the financial system in addressing it, so like with the commercial banks, with the insurance companies, to see how their lending practices, how their risks, how they should create their activities and incentives to move us in the direction that is desired. So these are some of the practical things, and our supervision people are working on the more precise ones of capital adequacy and so forth. So these are just some of the things I wanted to highlight. I could go on forever, but these are just some of the things I wanted to highlight in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hilaire. Very interesting area indeed, and for sure, lots for us to discuss because I thought your comments, particularly in the area of the investments of international reserves in support of ESG initiatives, something that resonates with CAF as the Green Bank of Latin America and the Caribbean. So lots for us to discuss there as we move forward. Distinguished colleagues, we also are honored to have with us the Secretary General of the Association of Caribbean States, Su Excelencia Rodolfo Sabonge. And greetings to you, Secretary General. And I'd like for us to invite you to focus on the matter of trade tariffs. And the question to you has to do with the fact that Caribbean countries still have very high trade tariffs with the rest of Latin America, in particular with South American countries. And we've noted that Caribbean countries also have room to improve in terms of trade facilitation. According to the trade facilitation indicators that were constructed by the OECD, Caribbean countries are still among the countries with the lowest values in terms of these indicators. What do you think is, why do you think this is the case, and what opportunities and challenges do you see for greater integration between the Caribbean and Latin American countries?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
First, I'd like to start by quoting Machiavelli. I also like quotes. And this refers to a question that Minister asked me while we were waiting at the beginning. It must be remembered that there is nothing more difficult to plan, more doubtful of success, nor more dangerous to manage than a new system. For the initiator has the enmity of all who would profit by the preservation of the old institution, and merely lukewarm defenders in those who gain by the new ones. And the reason I start with this is because the ACS was created initially by the initiative of CARICOM with the purpose of getting the CARICOM closer to Latin America. In fact, it was one of the initial purposes, integration. And after 28 years, it is interesting to see, and this addresses the question that the Minister asked me, if I thought that we had really achieved our goal. And I have to answer no. And then you start asking conceptually, what is it really that has affected achieving that goal? And to me, there are several factors, but one that I'd like to focus on, because right now everybody is trying to go back into integrating Latin America and the Caribbean. This is, I go to CELAC, I go to the OAS, I go to the United Nations. This is kind of the new trend. And CAF, same as IDB, everybody's turning their eye to the Caribbean. Now, as they say, it takes two to tango. And I really don't think that there has been enough effort put into understanding the cultural challenges of bringing the two together. In fact, it's more than two. We have in our membership 25 states and 10 associates, and that includes a lot more than the English-speaking Caribbean, includes other territories and so on. And I really think that part of it has to do with trust. We need to build trust. I don't think that that effort has really taken place. We were talking about language. Language is an issue, I have to agree. But I think that we need to work on trust. Now, having said that, I congratulate CAF because I can see that this effort is really pushing forward, establishing offices here and also including Caribbean countries. But one of the things that I have found as a challenge in the ACS is that we deal with organizations that are not structured the way they should be. We deal with IDB and their membership. We deal with CABE and their membership. We deal with CAF and their membership. Even the United Nations is structured with in a different way. We have to go, for instance, to Panama to meet with some of the, some of these organizations. We need to go to Barbados to meet with others. And even they mentioned the CDB. CDB is structured for its membership. We need to break away from those structures if we really want to make this happen. Integration is really at the forefront of everything that we want to do forward. Now, as I listened and I read the report is very well put, but it is still assembled on the basis of Latin America and the Caribbean. And you can see that the numbers and everything that is put in there is usually kind of brought forward from baselines that were developed for Latin America, but they are not necessarily applicable in the Caribbean. When you talk about borders, when you talk about infrastructure, when you talk about transportation, but in the case of Caribbean islands, those don't apply. We have a huge transportation and connectivity problem that is not necessarily going to be solved with infrastructure. We really need to look at services to understand that for us to really talk about integration, for us to talk about trade, for us to talk about nearshoring, near-sourcing, we really need to establish transportation in all modes in between the islands and the continent, because that is the biggest challenge, the way I see it. Maybe I'm biased because that's where I come from. I come from the maritime sector, from logistics, but all you need to do is try to fly amongst these countries, you know, and pay the huge prices. And then you can find, you know, you don't really need to be a rocket scientist or do a great analysis to know that the connectivity issue is 1, 2, 3, and 4, and it is not a low-hanging fruit. Yeah, maybe you can talk about tariffs, maybe I'm deviated from that, but in many instances, anything that can be changed just by policy is low-hanging fruit, even though it may seem difficult. But when you're talking about developing transport services in this region at reasonable prices with enough quality and frequencies, that is not low-hanging fruit. And for us to talk about trade and for us to talk about integration, we really need to establish a new transport systems strategy. That is one of the action plans that we have in the ACS, because we view ourselves as an entity that is going to look for ways to improve the region's connectivity and integration. But if you cannot do transport, you can definitely not improve trade, and much less intra-regional trade, and much less be part of any value chain. Because value chains are completely based on supply chain. You need to have supply chain embedded so that the value chain can work. So, because in the value chain, you need just in time and you need just in case. And those two elements need to be brought through connectivity. Now, when we talk about connectivity, then of course, you can go into the digital transformation, which is necessary for trade, for transport, and also for tourism, which is the other important pillar of economic growth for this region. So with that, I don't know if it's an introduction to...
It certainly puts the spotlight, Secretary General, on some of the key unique challenges that face the small islands of the Caribbean, and I thank you for that. It also helps us to bring into the discussion the topic that has been a recurring theme in our conversations, both yesterday in Guyana and then earlier today, you know, with the government of Trinidad and Tobago, with the private sector of Trinidad and Tobago, on, you know, this whole lack of transportation, ease of connectivity, the challenge with regard to moving people and goods across the region. And so that is definitely something that we will need to look at. And of course, through the excellent work of the ACS, this transportation, tourism, all of these issues are what your team is very much focused on. And I know together with CAF, we have our memorandum of understanding, and we have a lot of work to do to support each other in this area. So I look forward to discussing that more with you. I'd like to bring in Dr. Genevieve Remy into the discussion. Dr. Remy is one of our leading trade and integration experts in the region, and I have a burning question to put to you, Genevieve. According to the trade data that we saw, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, and Jamaica showed exports and imports in terms of GDP much higher than Latin American countries in 1980 to the 1984 period. However, these indicators did not increase. Moreover, they decreased in the last 30 years compared to the moderate increase that Latin America shows over the same period. What do you think are the main factors explaining this performance?
Well, thank you so much for the question, but I'm going to do like my preceding sort of speaker and take a little bit of license with some of the broader issues that came up as I read the report and the team at the SRC read the report. And first of all, thank you so much, Stacey, colleague from University of the West Indies Days, to you and your excellent team for getting me here. But also and battling all of the transportation and air transport and travel problems of getting here. But thank you to everyone who facilitated me being here. So I'm going to be a little cheeky because it's a shameless plug also for the SRC Trading Thoughts periodic journal that we put out in newspapers that the Trinidadian press has not taken up as yet. But we entitled one of our pieces, The Missing C in LAC. A little bit of what you're saying, Ambassador, which is that a lot of the focus of banks and especially the World Bank, a lot of these places that do statistical analysis lumps the Caribbean with Latin America. And there are good reasons for doing so, but there are also distinct issues that the region faces. And the reason it's important to do that kind of very in detail analysis of the regional, the Caribbean regional, special, distinct trade disadvantages and issues is not just because it guides policy internally, but also it gives added visibility to the region as worthy of the attention, not just of regional decision makers, but the global sort of landscape in terms of the unique challenges that confronts. So I'm really very happy for the work that CAF is doing. I'm really happy that Stacey and her team are working on the regional office. And I did notice that in the presentation today, a lot more of the focus of the statistics, especially for the second half of the report, looked at the Caribbean data. And I would recommend to the drafters and authors that they publish some of that updated data. And I was speaking to the presenter here who presented the report, that you could present that as a compendium or as a sort of an addition to the original report, because it looks at some of the specific data relevant to the Caribbean. So we're really putting the C front and center in LAC. To your question, though, Stacey, regarding what we can learn about the relative trade to export, the relative incidence of exports to GDP, and what the experience of Latin America in the 1980s up to, I would say, the 1990s tells us about the pathways in the past. This report is about the pathways in the future, but I think the macroeconomic context in the past is just as instructive as we seek to forge a trade strategy into the future, which is building on these intra-regional movements. And one of the important things that we scratched our head at the SRC thinking about that question is, how can you explain why the Caribbean, relative to all of the other sub-regional entities in Latin America, its export and its trade to GDP has not actually advanced? And there's a number of reasons. First of all, it's a relative question. So back in the 1980s, we know that Latin America was pursuing import substitution, all right, as its strategy, its main strategy. We had Raul Prebisch, we had, and thinking about the interaction between CARICOM and Latin America, we also had Sir Arthur Lewis, so really like giant thinkers in that space. But that was sort of the policy of Latin America, and only in the 2000s did it really begin to open up its trade, unilaterally undertake measures to service its GDP, its debt, but also to open up more in its sort of attempt to bring its economies up to scale. In the case of and another distinguishing feature about Latin America is obviously it has behemoth economies like Brazil, which don't need always to be as open as our smaller entities in CARICOM, but are always open just because of the dependence on the external market. So that can explain why, relative to CARICOM, especially in the 1980s and the 1990s, Latin America's relative trade to GDP was smaller. But what happened in the Caribbean? In the 1980s and in the 1990s, our share of trade and our sort of insertion into the global landscape was much higher. We had preferential arrangements, obviously, with the European Union. We also pursued a policy, if you read Demas and all of these sort of early thinkers of open regionalism, we led by export growth. And so we, relative to Latin America, adopted a policy reflected in the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, so it was much more outward looking. So what has happened? What has happened? When the economists, and I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer, again, thinking about the pathways in the path that will guide the future, when they look at what happened, let's say beginning in the 2000s, there's a huge stagnation in Caribbean economies. This is sort of typified by our lack of export diversification. We lost a lot of our market share in the European Union because of the dismantling of preferences. We also became just less competitive. And again, the question is why? Why did we become less competitive? Obviously, Trinidad and Tobago is a relative outlier here, fueled, I think the governor said, by its massive sort of assistance to the energy sector, but also relative to other sub-regions. The question is, why does the Caribbean not do so well? And we've postured a number of theories around that, kind of buttressed by the economic analysis we see, which is a lack of competitiveness and inability to keep up with some of the digital and skill sets needed to mechanize and to move into the more productive global value chain. So higher value, we're still, to a large extent, our tourism sectors are hit and by COVID, et cetera, and other broader sort of exogenous shocks. We can't blame COVID exclusively for the problem. That's a recent phenomenon. But it's really high debt as well, which limits our fiscal ability, limits our ability to move into sectors that are more growth-oriented and productive. Another huge issue for our region, and I really hope that CAF as a development bank is going to come to our aid, is access to finance. There are creative ways that the Caribbean countries are thinking about accessing, especially climate finance. But we also face problems like loss of correspondent banking. This is a big issue for Trinidad and Tobago. The Prime Minister has been before Congress in the United States arguing about that. But how do we ensure there's a new Bridgetown agenda, for instance, where Prime Minister Motley has been asking the international and the development banks to make finance more concessional, especially for middle and high income countries in the region. And I think at the end of the day, as Minister Strawn said, it's about competitiveness. It's about competitiveness of our smaller firms. We recently did a study on what are the needs of most of the smaller firms in CARICOM, the SMEs, and it really is educating them, giving them the pathways to become more competitive and to be trained to export, to be trained to understand the international regime that they're entering into. And I know my time is limited, but I do want to make one or two more points that are really relevant to the question of how this report can help us. This report can help us in a multiplicity of ways. One, it begins to allow us to think about what our future pathways are. And yes, the harder infrastructure that is mentioned in there, like the physical infrastructure is important, the global value chains are important, but I think, again, Ambassador mentioned it, that we are services economies. We are digital, increasingly digital economies. We also have to broach this question of, I don't know if it's trust, I don't know if it's cultural affinity, but when you look at the numbers, a lot of the attention now is on our trade with Africa. I just attended an Afro-Caribbean conference where we were looking at how do we even get our goods and services to Africa, which is much, much further away, and we can't even think about the region. And even by estimates by the ITC, which says there's a future market in Africa of 1 billion, there's a recent study that there's a regional market in the Caribbean and Latin America of 78 billion. So the opportunity is right before us. We do have these separate intra-regional entities, but we don't do a lot of trade among the intra-regional entities in the CARICOM and the Latin America. So it's really not we're creating these silos among ourselves. We have the infrastructure, we have the ACS, we have CELAC, we have 33 bilateral agreements, but we need to begin the conversation of increasing and dismantling the silos we've created for ourselves. So these are some of the macro questions. I know maybe I tried to answer your question, but I also want to challenge us in this room to start thinking creatively. And I think CAF and its regional orientation in the Caribbean, based right here in Port of Spain, begins the conversation that we have to have, leveraging the ACS connections, leveraging the IDB connections, and getting a vision for the region that we can all buy into. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr.
nice.
Remy. Thank you. And thanks to all our panelists. I think each of you has touched on some important points, some really critical points for us, as you said, to continue the conversation. I'm thankful to our presenter, our economists, who outlined all of the various chapters and the rich information and data that is captured in the Red Report. And certainly, this will allow us to rethink, our strategies for trade and for integration moving forward, but also to carve out these future pathways for regional development. I'd like at this point for you to join me in giving once more a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you to the Honorable Minister Strawn, who has joined us virtually. Thank you very much, sir, for your participation. And at this stage, I'd like to hand us back over to our Master of Ceremonies so that we can close off this afternoon's program.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the panelists and, of course, our moderator, Dr. Kennedy, for such an interesting exchange, a lot of insight. Do you agree? Yes. Very insightful conversation. And as we go forward, we learn, and I don't think anybody here can say definitively that they know everything. So I am learning as I go along, and I appreciate that very much. For the closing remarks for this event, I would like to welcome Mr. Christian Hassanelli, Corporate Vice President of Strategic Programming of CAF, Development Bank of Latin America. Let's put our hands together for him as he comes.
The light is too high. Well, buenos días a todos y todas los que nos están viendo por streaming. Good afternoon to everyone that are here. Thanks for your presence on what has been the presentation of CAF's Development Flagship Report on Economic Development. As you observed in the previous presentation, this year we decided to focus our attention of trade facilitation, infrastructure, and global value chain as the cornerstone that ensure the pathways to integration in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is something that belongs to our heart. As our president say, integration is the way, and we are here for that. Please allow me to express how grateful we are to be here in Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago. We have promoted here since 1994 the strengthening of both private and public sector in order to contribute to countries' producer diversification. And we have also worked together over the year to foster economic and social infrastructure for all the citizens. In that regard, I would like to particular thanks to Minister of Finance of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, called Imber, my friend, and the task force of the minister with whom CAF has worked very, very closely in the organization of this international seminar. Also, I would like to extend my gratitude to the Minister of Finance of Barbados, the Governor of the Central Bank, thank you very much, who is also our member in the board. Rodolfo Sabuone, thank you very much for to be here. Jenny, Yves, Remy, to all our CAF team, Giampiero, Liam, that make an excellent presentation, all the CAF team here in Trinidad and Tobago, and of course our manager, Stacy. Thank you very much for showing CAF in the last year, in the last months, last days. We have a lot of work to do in the future. And of course, President Diaz-Granados, as he said, he's the first president to be here in Trinidad and Tobago. I think that this that say too much of him. Today we have a meeting with the Prime Minister and Minister called Imbert, and the Prime Minister said that this president had a new start in the relationship between CAF and Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm sure that this is very, very true. While there were no significant increase in international trade, as we observe in the report, but I think that today we are here to change that. We know that there are some barriers and challenges in the geography of our territory, such as border crossing and other non-tariff difficulties. And in addition, this is a visible lack of an analysis of complementarity between countries. And the response of the report of that question is the need to work in the three different areas mentioned before: trade facilitation, physical, functional and digital infrastructure, and productive integration and conversion towards a regional environmental, social, and climate sustainable agenda. In that regional scenario, our organization has demonstrated that it's the local partner of the region which has the best capillarity in terms of adaptation to the particularities of the shareholders in a quick, efficient, and effective way. As Stacy likes to say, we work in two velocities, fast and faster. And we believe that this is necessary to promote integration with a clear political will and with the establishment of consensus. But at the same time, we need a pragmatic work agenda that allows us to move from vision to action in shortened time frames. What the Pope Francis called unity in diversity is not other thing than our commitment to regional integration of Latin America and Caribbean countries, union and consultation, to think as a bloc and to negotiate more powerfully at the global concert. For this reason, again, as President Diaz-Granados said, I would like to recognize the work of Trinidad and Tobago as a fundamental Caribbean ally to our institution. First of all, the relationship with the country grew exponentially during the last years, thanks to the leadership of Minister Imbert, who pushed us, between other things, to support our new capitalization of CAF. Thank you, Mr. Minister, for your leadership, and thank you very much for your friendship. Secondly, it will allow us to become, as our executive president mentioned at the opening of this seminar, and in all seminars that we are going, the Green Bank and the Bank of the Economic Reactivation of Latin America and the Caribbean. In that way, we will promote our work for the integration of the region. The last one. The integration in that way, we will promote our work for the integration of the region and to help generate sustainable development for our shareholder and member countries. And last but not least, we aim to support all nations from Caribbean based on the value proposition that was adopted unanimously by our board and the assembly you look at this picture, Minister Colm is there signing the new capitalization. Thank you very much again. And I think that this integration that I mentioned before, as I said, is in our heart and is the purpose of what we are working in CAF. These are the reasons why we will continue to offer technical, financial, and knowledge assistance to every country in the region. Our ultimate goal is to pursue dignified, full, and equal living conditions for all Latin American and Caribbean, and a real regional capacity to optimize and ensure the success of its joint decision. We are very happy to be here today, celebrating 10 years as Trinidad and Tobago as full member. We are very happy to opening a regional hub for all the Caribbean here in Trinidad and Tobago, thanks to the leadership of Sergio Díaz-Granado. And we are here to think the future, but we are here to build this future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hassan Ali. As we draw closer to the culmination of this part of this afternoon's proceedings, we have one final video about CAF's relationship with CARICOM. So let's take a look at that right now.
With a portfolio of projects across Latin America and the Caribbean that exceeds $30 billion US, CAF's mission is to promote sustainable development and regional integration as a means of improving the quality of life of millions of people. CAF, the Spanish acronym for Corporación Andina de Fomento, is a multilateral development bank established 52 years ago as the financial branch of the Andean community. Today, CAF has 21 member countries from Latin America and the Caribbean, Portugal, and Spain. Among CARICOM member countries, Barbados, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago are shareholders of CAF. In Trinidad and Tobago, a loan portfolio of $1.13 billion is providing support to critical development areas, including fiscal consolidation, road, air and sea infrastructure, flood prevention, and digital transformation. Timely support was provided to help protect livelihoods during the pandemic, and technical assistance has complemented the government's drive toward economic diversification. In Barbados, a loan portfolio of $180 million is contributing to addressing road repairs, water provision, and tax administration reform for a better access to public services and quality of life of its citizens, as well as helping the country to effectively tackle the impact of the pandemic. In December 2021, the board of CAF approved a historic capital increase of $7 billion for the period of 2023 to 2030. This means that the bank's total portfolio will grow from the current $30 billion to approximately $60 billion in 2030. This capital increase and projected expansion across the region are based on several comparative advantages that distinguish CAF among the multilateral development banks operating in the region. These include its effective governance structure, flexibility, agility, and client-oriented approach. CAF's strategic focus is to support its member countries with post-COVID recovery and climate change. As the Green Bank of Latin America and the Caribbean, CAF is committed to facilitating the transition of member countries to green and low-carbon economies. CAF is committed to enhancing its contribution to regional integration initiatives and to strengthening its partnerships with local governments, national development banks, and the private sector, while seeking to maximize the development impact of its interventions. We recognize that the development challenges faced by the Caribbean have been exacerbated since the onset of the pandemic, and CAF is keen to expand its support for the region. We also believe that there are important lessons to be learned and shared between Latin America and the Caribbean so that we can strengthen synergies and achieve scale for large regional investment projects in areas such as climate change, energy security, food security, regional integration, and many others. CAF is committed to working with CARICOM countries to better understand the needs of Caribbean communities and to channel resources to accelerate post-COVID-19 recovery in the Caribbean. In 2022, the decision was taken to establish a regional office for the Caribbean and to convert CAF's Port of Spain office into a regional hub to provide development assistance to Caribbean countries as we work towards a future in which all countries in the region are members of CAF with access to a new important source of development finance. CAF is committed to providing more opportunities and new pathways to a better future for the Caribbean and Latin America. We look forward to working in partnership with you. CAF, Development Bank of Latin America.
Enjoy that? Yes. Our relationship and our future looks bright, and we look forward to that. Now, on behalf of CAF, Development Bank of Latin America, and the Ministry of Finance of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, I would like to thank everyone for joining us in this event today. We also appreciate the support of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. And before I go, let me remind you that this flagship report is available for free download on the website coteca.caf.com. So you can check that out there as we wrap up this part of the proceedings. Thank you very much for your attendance. Now, we are going to be escorting, as we close off this part, to go downstairs. We would ask you kindly to be seated as we escort the dignitaries out of the auditorium, and then the rest of us will follow to suit. All right? Thank you very much for your attendance. You're all invited to join us now to the ground floor after we escort the dignitaries for the continuation of today's program. Thank you.